Welcome to Coconut Oil Stardust and Dope Vibes. I am your resident fairy godmother, Tamara Angela. And today's episode, I am putting on my clinical hat. I am a fairy godmother in the sense of helping people to operate in their spiritual gifts. But I'm a psychic medium who chose to go into clinical mental health for a living. One of the things I chose to go into. I did that for what feels like a really long time. And just a little background, there's so many different things you can do with getting a master's in social work. And most people assume that that is like working for family and children's services and stuff like that. I've never done any of that. All I've ever done is clinical work, which was individual therapy, family therapy, and providing clinical treatment. I worked many years as a licensed clinical therapist doing, in Georgia we call it, you were able to sign a 1013, which is an involuntary order for getting someone committed if they are showing any signs of like self-harm or harm to others. And all I've ever done is do clinical assessments, biopsychosocials, and diagnoses. What does that mean? In every arena that I've ever worked in, whether it was a community mental health where I was going out to service clients who were adult or children, who lived in group homes, who needed clinical assessments done so they could qualify for services, qualify for medication, qualify for disability. Or if I was providing services for clients who were currently incarcerated, doing group therapy. I even serviced hospice care, providing individual therapies. And all I've ever done is do what we call a diagnosis. I also worked in acute care, so that is working with people who were coming through the emergency room and needed to be assessed. And this is substance abuse as well as mental health. I did an equal amount of both. And so my job was always to see the person in their current state, no matter what that state of mind was, and do an assessment to provide a diagnosis to get them entered into care. And I had to do complete write-ups of what, just in general, just to make it plain, I had to do these in-depth write-ups of what their mental state was. How did they present? That's basically what a clinical assessment is. You come in, I see you where you are, and I have to assess where you're at. We use the what we call it's a diagnostic manual. It's called the DSM-5. There's actually criteria for diagnosing people. There's actual criteria. Now, I've heard some folks get into, I don't believe in this and I don't believe in that. You don't have to believe in it for it to be something that is used. We have to have a tool across the board where everybody has a standard for viewing people clinically. So you don't have to believe in it. You don't have to trust it. It is what it is. But there are certain criteria, and this diagnostic tool is fine-tuned quite often because people and behaviors are adapting all the time, right? Humans are evolving and adapting, and we have to, certain things come up in the diagnostic manual that weren't there before, and then things morph into other things, and so they recategorize things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about depression and suicide and um, how we diagnose this, how it can present, because I want us to have a healthy and effective conversation about like relationships. Like we're having this, there's this performative conversation going on, and this is what this is December 15th. I'm recording this because there was a recent suicide of a celebrity, and here's the deal. This is an episode, I know people like trigger warnings and things like that. We're going to get in depth when it comes to mental health sometimes on this podcast. So if this is something that you feel like you can't handle, it's totally fine. You can, log off and feel free to listen to any of the other episodes. But we're going to have this in-depth conversation, and it's going to be clinical. I'm not giving opinions on things or anything that I feel. I'm giving clinical expertise. And I'm also going to give you, I'm very anecdotal. I like parables and things like that. That's how I speak. I'm also going to give you some insight into my experience and what my day would look like and how I would diagnose someone. So this comes from degrees, experience, knowledge, years of doing this. This isn't something I picked up or I Googled or anything like that. And for some of you, you're not always used to me stepping out and wearing this hat, but because I kind of work at the intersection of mental health and spirituality, and there is an intersection. But this episode is going to be a bit more on the clinical side because I want us to really have an effective conversation. I take that back. This is probably going to be the intersection because we're going to talk about like having like interpersonal relationships and things like that. There's this just performative thing that happens in society where it's like something happens to someone and, you look to the celebrity or the person. Well, what did they say on their page? Or did they speak out? And we don't even give people a chance to grieve or process or even live real life, right? To even like that's their real life. Something happened in their real life. And we're like, well, if they don't speak about it within 12 to 24 hours, they don't care. That's crazy. It's crazy. And it's crazy because what happens is blogs pick up information, and then that's all we see in the news cycle, and then that's all people are talking about, and then people are sharing opinions, and it's like, okay, so we have all of these things happening, and it's great, I think, to garner discussion, but at some point we have to change narratives. We can't keep going on opinions, and we have to look to the people who actually have expertise to kind of lead us through this. So this is the same thing that I'm talking about, like when we're watching a public trial of someone that's in the public eye. Like if you're not a lawyer, if you're not a public defender, if you're not a paralegal, like if you've never done any of those things, like you're giving an opinion. You're giving an opinion. This is so funny to me, but it's like even if you've been arrested, all you're doing is giving an opinion because you only have one side of the law. You don't really understand the depths of the law in that way. And this comes up a lot of times for me when I'm talking mental health because I'll be giving some insight on something and somebody will say, well, I know all about this because my brother is bipolar. No, what you know is your brother's experience with him being bipolar. It doesn't mean you understand the diagnostic manual. It doesn't even mean that you understand fully the diagnosis and the richness of all of that. you understand his experience, and that information is valuable. But there's a spectrum of things, and there's a full scope, and there's red tape and insurance and all this other stuff. So you have a microcosm of an experience, which is valuable, and you know what you know there, but it doesn't trump what someone in a position of knowledge knows based on them doing that for a job. And we've kind of got to get out of that idea, that this DIY idea we have of things, where it's like, oh, I see this, and instead of talking to someone who may have expertise here, I'm just gonna go look it up on YouTube. Are there good things on YouTube? Are there good things on the internet? Yes. And what I'm excited about is that there are way more therapists who have great followings on online now, and they're disseminating this information in a way that's digestible, and I love that, like, because that wasn't always happening before. So we're talking suicide, we're talking depression, we're also talking a couple other diagnoses, because depression isn't the only time that the idea of self-harm comes up. And we're also going to talk self-harm, because self-harm isn't always suicide. Self-harm can be cutting, and doing other injurious acts, risk-taking. It can be so many different things. So where I'm kind of starting with this is that there's this performative conversation that's going on that's like, check on your strong friends. It's one of those obligatory things. We have these obligatory things in American conversation. And I'm sure other cultures do too. But in American conversation, it's like, oh, somebody passes away. It's like, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. Are you really? Like, I mean, and it doesn't mean that you're not, but there's a lot of times we just kind of say things because it's like, oh, here's this situation, insert this comment. And we don't look for any depth of anything. And it's interesting to me where we're having this performative conversation where it's like, check on your friends. You never know what they're going through. He didn't look depressed. Oh my gosh, he just posted a video and he was smiling. We've got to change the narrative, because despair and happiness can coexist. We're not one-dimensional beings where we only feel one thing during the course of the day, right? We feel so many emotions and we have so many thoughts. I was sitting in a Dharma talk yesterday during Zazen, and it's Shifu said that there was some research that we experience like 8,000 thoughts a day, somewhere around there, and our attention span is like 8 to 10 seconds long at this point. That means our mind is running like more than a mile a minute. Our mind is just all over the place. So you have a belief system, an internal belief system that's either developed by your own DNA or what you've been taught. And that belief system develops your thoughts. Your thoughts develop your feelings. And your feelings come out of your mouth or through your actions, right? So we're in this space where we're having this conversation around mental health, and saying, check on your strong friends. But like 2 seconds ago, we were saying nobody wants to be strong. Then there's also these conversations around people not even ever really understanding how to be a friend. We have these really warped relationships that are based out of possession and not based out of love. And I've seen conversations where people say they don't require daily conversation with the person they're dating. Like they're seriously dating this person and they don't require a text, a phone call, or contact on a daily basis. This is I've seen this over and over again. So in my mind, I'm like, when are you checking on somebody? When? Because you don't even text or have phone calls. This is performative conversation. This is stuff that sounds good. And it's never, if we continue to say things that sound good, we're never going to really address anything. We're never going to really change these narratives. We need to inject some truth here. Truth is, and this is just to start the foundation of the conversation, most people have trouble with their own emotions. Most people in today's society live in a space of restricted emotions. We lack empathy, by and large. We lack empathy. And we've been completely desensitized to so many things because you got those 8,000 thoughts a minute and you're plugged in all the time in all these different places, right? So if you're plugged into all these places, like when do your emotions come into play? Most people have trouble identifying how they feel on any given basis for anything. And so most conversation that I see is very reactive. It's very reactive. This is why everybody spends so much time triggered. Oh, I'm triggered over this. You're not emotionally stable. That's typically where people are. They don't know how to express their emotions correctly. It's not that you're triggered. It's that you haven't processed certain things to know how to navigate the world in a space of emotional health and emotional intelligence. And so every single thing sets you off. People barely read. They just, there's a video going around right now of something that happened at a HBCU, and the video is pretty intense, and people are reacting, and I'm like, what happened here? What happened before this? How did we get to this? People will and I'm not saying that video is edited, but in other cases, people will edit a clip to sensationalize something so you get this reaction, right? And so now we live in this space where people are very reactive because they get fed 2-second clips that are intense. And so with those 8,000 thoughts a second, you never, all you're doing is processing that, and then you process the next thing, then you look at the next thing, then you look at the next thing, then you look at the next thing. Nobody's actually processing anything or actually digging into a certain situation to even know what's going on and to get all of the information. And so we live in this raw state of emotion all the time that is unbalanced and ready to go off. This is how we got cancel culture all the time. Everybody's mad. Everybody's got a comment. Nobody knows how to sit, actually intake the information intuitively and with some discernment, process, and then give it back. It's problematic sometimes even for some folks to say, you know what, I want to see all of what's going on before I make a comment. Oh no, look at no, I need to know what's going on first. What actually is happening here? What am I looking at before I make a decision? And so because we live in that space, it's interesting to me how we have these conversations around mental health. It's like, it's this, what we think is empathy. It's not really empathetic to just be like, check in on your friends when you don't even have a clear definition of who your friends are and you don't ever talk about emotions in the first place. Like if you don't have friendships that have any depth and everything is superficial, when exactly are you checking on people and their emotions? Because see, the flip side is people who are dealing with things are saying nobody is checking on me. And I think that is very true because we spend so much time in superficial relationships. People don't understand where it's safe to release those things because we don't really have those friendships. The other thing is, I think we're so bogged down with so many things happening in this world. Sometimes people, like, you really do need to go to a therapist. You really do need to see your spiritual guide. You really do need to do those things because you can't spend a lifetime unloading and dumping on your friends, right? There needs to be a balance of all of that. I think what's happening now, that performative empathy, it's not giving us an outlet. It's like, oh yeah, I hate that this happened, and I think people genuinely are like heartbroken with a lot of things, but then most of the time people are just showing up because it's the hot topic, and then we turn around and have the same conversation again the next time, unfortunately, something like this happens. So where I want to kind of start out is just depressive disorders. There are several. I'm going to kind of give you guys just an overview. I keep like what we call like the DSM pocket guide. It kind of gives you, it's a thick book. It's a really thick book. It's huge. But I keep a copy of the pocket guide because it's got like kind of the basic things that we see all the time and how to diagnose them. While we're talking, I'm sipping on green tea and ginger with honey. So, here we go. So, depressive disorders. There's several. It's not just like depression and that's it, right? You could have major depressive disorder. There's one called dysthymia, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And there's also a category for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So you have these depressive disorders, and where we also see depression show up is under bipolar disorder. There's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. We also see it show up there. So with bipolar, this is what they used to in the old school called manic depressive. You have the manic episode, which is like this really elevated behaviors. We call them elevated behaviors. So they could have insomnia, just like lots of agitation, restlessness, kind of sort of can't sit down. Some people mistake this for hyperactivity, like ADHD. Some people mistake it for that. These really huge thoughts like, oh, I could go get that done. And it's like this huge undertaking that it's like, you can't get that done in that amount of time kind of thing. Bursts of activity, irritability. Maybe this is where risk-taking behaviors come in. Compulsive eating, compulsive gambling, compulsive sexual behavior can fall under there. Lots of things that it's like, they look like they're just like, ooh, this is the type of person that has a good time, but they're actually having a manic episode. And then also under there is the major depressive episode, which this is kind of the definition that they use for use under depressive disorders, indicated by the presence of at least 5 of the following during a sustained 2-week period. persistent negative mood, diminished satisfaction or pleasure from engaging in nearly all activities, right? Like you just don't find pleasure in anything. You could have weight loss, weight gain, even chronic insomnia or hypersomnia, which is like either you can't sleep or you're sleeping too much. Agitation, fatigue, like that fatigue, it's just like you're just constantly lethargic and constantly tired. This is the feelings of worthlessness. You can't focus. Your suicide ideations also come in under the depressive episode, right? And so what is an ideation? An ideation is what we kind of characterize clinically as like the thought, right? So the thought kind of crosses your mind. Oh, it would be better if I wasn't here. Very much, it's usually characterized by a state of wanting to escape where you're at, where you're just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I would like to step out of this. When I used to have to do assessments, what I would ask the person is it like, if this situation, if how you're feeling, if what is maybe causing the issue, if the current space where you're at right now, if it lifted, if it felt better, if the stress went away, if the perceived stress went away, because sometimes it's a perception of something that's going to happen versus something actually happened. If that went away, would you still have those thoughts? Some people, it's situational and they're like, nah, like I wouldn't feel this way if I had more money, for example. Somebody who's dealing with ongoing mood issues like depressive disorders or bipolar disorders, there's never really that time where that lifts. It's just that these thoughts kind of come in waves for them, right? So they're constantly kind of like these thoughts, they're intrusive thoughts. They just kind of pop up. It doesn't mean that they necessarily do anything about it. It's just that these things kind of cross their mind where they're just like, like I would be okay if I went to sleep and didn't wake up. But they don't really have a plan of action. They don't really say, I've thought about taking a bunch of the Tylenol, or they're just it's like these waves of emotions get intense and they're just like, I don't want to feel this anymore, right? It's a level of pain, it's a level of anguish, and it's deep rooted. Now, when the ideation comes with the plan of action, this is a step towards a level of seriousness, right? It's not that we don't take the ideation serious, but those can kind of waver and they can come and go, and we'll see them cycle through different emotions. We're still watching. We're still vigilant. When it comes to the ideation, when it comes to the actual plan of action, it doesn't mean that they're going to execute. It doesn't mean that they'll ever execute. It means that they've thought about a way to they have an exit plan, right? Typically, men are more successful in suicide. So we have unsuccessful attempts and we have successful attempts. Typically, men are more successful because they use more engaging ways of doing it that are more definitive, right? So men are typically the ones who will hang, use a gun, use a weapon. Women do, and I know this sounds crazy, but we used to call it a vanity approach. That's a really old school way of talking about it, but it's usually pills. Women cut a lot as well, but it's usually something kind of internal, just like go to sleep and not wake up. That's typically what women do. Or women will engage in reckless behaviors that fall under those manic episodes. the, drug, sometimes these overdoses were actually suicides. You didn't OD by accident. It could look like it though, but it wasn't an accident. They were out there gorging and recklessly engaging in things, going out with people that something could happen. And then it looks like an accident, but it's not. That's typically what women's modalities look like. And so you have these ideations, and then you have these actual plans. It's like, no, I saw this out. So this isn't like TV where they write this, ominous note and they leave all their possessions. Sometimes people just leave. Right? They don't necessarily talk about the plan. Sometimes that plan comes up in a conversation and it never happens. And then 5 years later, they act on it. Sometimes they have the plan and it's just like for them a safety thing where it's just like, oh, well, I have this plan in case I ever want to do it, but I'm not really going to do it. Here's the thing about suicide. None of us can call it. Not the therapist, not your loved one, not the person closest to you. Nobody. Nobody knows the exact moment except for the person who is carrying out the attempt. That's it. That's it. It's difficult. It's difficult. Nobody's to blame. You can do everything that you can clinically to keep the person safe. You can do everything with love in a conversation to keep the person safe. You can tell them everything that they need to hear. You can have the most empathy, the most compassion, and they will still attempt and possibly be successful. There's not really anything that you can do. And that's where we have trouble with it as humans. And we're like, so here goes the hindsight with the conversation. Well, they looked happy. This is difficult because sometimes, and I'm going to give you just a few examples. When a loved one is suffering and they pass, sometimes you just feel relief. You're like, oh, thank God they let go. Jesus, thank you. And people want to shame you for feeling that way. There's a sense of relief sometimes. Sadness will wash over, but sometimes there's a sense of relief that they're no longer struggling because you love them and you don't want them to struggle. It was hard to see that. You can smile because we have those 8,000 thoughts in a day and still be in a state of despair. Like you can still recognize when something is funny sometimes. You know what I mean? Like, even with the description that I read where it's like, you don't find any pleasure in any activity, but maybe you went out with a friend and they pulled you out. They forced you to go out to brunch. And they said something really funny. So you laughed. Because, hey, you have a sense of humor. You're not just sitting there like a lump on a log. You're there. Underneath, there's really this deep state of despair. We have a lot of moods that we all cycle through normally, naturally, right? The things that I talked about here are just like depressive disorders and things related to bipolar, because that's typically, in my experience, where I saw people attempt. Those were the folks that I typically saw attempt. The other folks that I saw attempt were going through like acute stress. They were already maybe going through depression, bouts with high anxiety, sometimes my folks who had psychotic disorders, some of them may have harmed themselves under a delusion. They may have harmed themselves under some type of delusion, thinking that something was coming for them, attacking them, that kind of thing. It was, I mean, they could have done it then. Lots of my schizoaffective people, schizoaffective, that is characterized by a person who has the major symptoms that characterize schizophrenia, but they also present with some level of depression or some level of manic episodes, right? A lot of them would attempt. But people who have like acute stress, I lost my job, and maybe they don't see a way out. The tunnel gets really dark very quickly. I see that happen often, and people are like, I didn't see that coming. You know, an acute stress happens and they go and they drive their car into ongoing traffic. Looks like an accident. It wasn't. Long-term stress. Just never seeing a way out of any of the things that keep piling on and piling on and piling on. I see that. I've seen that over the years as well. So when people say they didn't look like they were depressed, what does that look like? What is a description of a depressed person? Because people walk around functionally depressed, anxious, manic, psychotic all the time, functionally. And with the way people misuse narcissism, I wouldn't expect people to know what depressed look like. There's not a look. That is the type of statement that is as ignorant as saying, you know, both of my kids are autistic and on the spectrum. And people say, they don't look autistic. Well, what does that look like? I don't understand. So there's not a look. So that's my whole thing. There's not like this checklist in that way that says, yes, I use the DSM as a tool and as a guide. And it says, well, you've experienced X amount of things over X amount of time. So that typically looks like this diagnosis. Diagnoses can change because we get a snapshot of a person in a specific time period when they present. And then when you get into understand their long term and their life and all their socioeconomic background, their environmental issues and things like that, you get a broader scope and you can give a better diagnosis, right? And so there's no way you can just walk up to somebody and just know that they're depressed. You can't. You really can't. I think that's hard for people to cope with. I think it's hard for people to understand that a lot of times people wear a mask because we're taught to do that in society a lot of times. It's like, suck it up, get it together, because you know something else is going to happen in a minute. So you got to move with that. It's like constant. There's this constant, like, you got to move, you got to move, you got to do this, you got to do that kind of thing. And it never leaves us time to process. One thing I really want to point out, it burns my biscuits when the church describes depression, mental health, clinical diagnoses, bipolar, psychosis, when they describe them as those diagnoses and those symptoms and behaviors as demons, we got to pray the demon out. It's not a demon. Are there times that people have demons and need them driven out? Damn right there are. Oh, for sure. That's another conversation. But to tell somebody we're going to pray this spirit off of you, it's grossly irresponsible. Grossly irresponsible. And it doesn't speak to the scope of what a person is dealing with. It doesn't respect what a person is actually dealing with when they're dealing with the depths of trying to grasp their emotions and create stability and feel like they have a safe space. We've got to get, that has got to go. It is, it doesn't speak to the person's actual experience. I think the other thing that I just want to make sure I mention in this conversation is that sometimes people feel like suicide is their only option. And this is where loved ones struggle, because they're like, there's this perception that you're weak, or you lack coping skills, or you couldn't handle something. And so you chose that as an option, and it's selfish. And why would they do that? And why aren't they thinking about the people that they leave behind? To me, actually having that conversation is the conversation that's selfish. So basically what you're saying is, you were going through something, I don't understand it, and you didn't think about me. Yikes. Yikes, yikes, yikes. Let's change the narrative there. My loved one is going through something so deep in their soul that is painful and that they can't describe. I'm hurt as well. And I love them, and I want to see them through, and I want them to be safe. But I can't control the outcome, and that makes me feel. Own your own emotions and remove it from that loved one's. They're going through something. I started to look at this way when I was doing some work as a medium and actually understanding the stages of death, the layers of death, and doing mediumship readings for loved ones. And what I understood, and I say this all the time, I said the living haunt the dead. We can't leave them be. Oh, my grandma is gone. Let me go wake her up and talk to her. Girl, can she rest? Can she rest? Did she say she wants you to bother her? Did she say that? Did she come to you? Don't go waking her up. Let her rest. We have that same frame of reference when someone feels like suicide is their only option. Well, you got to stay here with me. You can't escape what you're feeling. It's unfair to me. Have you thought about how they're living and the depth of suffering that they're going through when they can't connect the dots and make things make sense, and they don't feel like they can push through? You can't just shake somebody out of depression. You can't just shake someone out of psychosis. You can't pray somebody out of a manic episode. You can't lay hands on them. You can't regulate their energy in that way. There's no conversation that you can have that you are that powerful that your conversation is going to overcome the depths of their emotions, because you have that power, right? No, we don't. None of us do. That's what's difficult. And that's the part we struggle with. And us lingering there is why I think we're not receptive to gaining a better understanding of what a person's experience is like and why it even gets to that point, how it gets to that point. We don't really even have that much of a clear understanding. We just know that it gets to that point for this person and for our loved one. It doesn't mean that you aren't worthy of them talking to, or they don't trust you. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that they have an internal battle, an internal struggle that's bigger than them, that's bigger than you. It has nothing to do with you. It doesn't mean that they don't love you. It doesn't mean that they don't care. It doesn't mean that they didn't think about you. If this is a perceived option for them, it means that they are struggling. And that goes back to what I said in the beginning about how we just widely lack empathy. We have these conversations surrounding mental health and things as serious as self-harm and suicide, and people point it back to themselves. Well, why didn't they think about me? Yikes. They can barely deal with what they're thinking about what they're thinking about and feeling is so heavy. They can barely handle that themselves. When did they have time and capacity to think about you? We've got to reshape that narrative. And it doesn't always mean that there's a medication that someone can take. This isn't like take a Tylenol and bloop, your headache is gone. You take this Zyprexa, you take this, medication, you take this Wellbutrin, it's all going to go away. No, that's not how that works. It is a constant maintenance. It's constant maintenance. There's not a cure. We're maintaining, we're coping, we're learning, we're living. It's ongoing. Some days are going to be way worse than others. Some days are going to be unbearable, and some days are going to be good. A person doesn't just always indefinitely live there. There are times where the moods lift. I think the last part of this conversation is highly about, I'm always championing for men to speak out with mental health. I'm so happy to see so many male therapists stepping up online, creating these spaces. I'm ecstatic to see Black male therapists holding space for Black men. I've seen women say, I don't never see where Black men are going for therapy. Well, because you're not invited to the party. You ain't supposed to be there. You're supposed to be over there with your own therapist. You can go to the Black male therapist if you want, but these Black men have these spaces, and they do come to therapists. I have Black men that come to me often, and I'm so happy to see Black male therapists creating spaces and showing that Black men have a space to go and relax and relieve their mind and get the emotional regulation that they need. I love it. It's difficult for men out here because men are attuned in many societies to not have feelings. You can't have feelings. Everything's restricted. You can't feel like that. So what are they supposed to do? You're only a provider. This all you do. There's no balance in our relationships. I did a Sunday moment where I said each relationship has to have 2 givers. 2. Men aren't valued anymore. Men are seen, lots of feminism has made men as a whole the perpetrator. And And we are suffering for that because men aren't valued in our society. Men aren't valued. They're not valued until they become a hashtag, and then people care. Slightly. I think this is such a layered conversation. I wanted to just kind of give a little insight. I know there's definitely another part of this conversation, and I want to have it with some colleagues. I'm going to be having some colleagues come on the show, come on the podcast, and have some conversation with me coming up in 2023. We're going to be talking about a lot of things like the full scope of mental health and dealing with mental health. We're going to do that by and large across the scale because I want us to open these conversations. And by all means, I never want you guys just to hear my experience. There's so many of us out here with so many great experiences working in the field of mental health and substance abuse. I want us to be able to share that in a relatable space that feels comfortable, because people still highly stigmatize what it's like to go to therapy. And some people have just had like crap experiences going to therapy. So I get it. But we have to change that narrative and make mental health feel more accessible and more relatable, so people come in and get their tune-up. You take your car for a tune-up. You know, if your phone's not working, you stop and you get that taken care of. So we got to do the same thing overall with our physical health, our mental health, and our spiritual health. So thanks for tuning in today. Please share this episode with others. Start the conversation for yourselves. And thank you for joining in with me, Fairy Godmother, on Coconut Oil Stardust and Dope Vibes.